Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to share one of the most outrageous HOA experiences I've ever had. My name is Mike Chin. I'm 32 years old and have been working as a professional videographer for the past 8 years. About 3 months ago, I moved into Maple Ridge Estates, thinking it would be the perfect neighborhood, beautiful scenery, nice homes, and supposedly a community-oriented atmosphere. Little did I know that the HOA president had other ideas. I invested in a high-end DJI Mavic 3 Pro drone last year. It cost nearly $2,000, but it's essential for my work filming real estate properties and nature documentaries. I've always been extremely careful about following the rules. I have all the proper FAA licenses, never fly above the legal height limit, and respect people's privacy. I even notify my immediate neighbors when I'll be doing flight tests, just to be courteous. That's why what happened next was so shocking and completely uncalled for. Patricia Walters, our 58-year-old HOA president, runs this neighborhood like her own personal kingdom. From day one she had her eyes on me. Within my first week here, I received a warning notice about my trash cans being visible from the street for exactly 45 minutes after collection. Apparently, they needed to be hidden within 30 minutes or face a fine. 2 weeks later, she personally knocked on my door to inform me that my mailbox was approximately 2 shades darker than the approved Hampton blue in our covenant. But things really escalated when I began using my drone. Despite flying it legally and responsibly, I started receiving complaints from the HOA. First, it was a notice saying neighbors were concerned about privacy. I responded with information about my flight paths and camera angles, showing I wasn't capturing anyone's private property except my own. Then came warnings about noise pollution, even though my drone is one of the quietest models available. The situation reached a breaking point last week when I checked my email and found an urgent community notice, announcing that the HOA board had implemented an emergency rule banning all unauthorized surveillance devices, clearly targeting my drone. They never held a proper vote or followed state regulations for rule changes. I spent hours researching and confirmed what I suspected. HOAs cannot override FAA regulations for properly licensed drone operations, especially when operated within your own property boundaries. I printed out all the relevant legal information thinking I might need it if there was another confrontation. Unfortunately, I was right, but I never expected what happened next. Last Saturday was a perfect day for flying, clear skies, light breeze, and I had just installed a new polarizing filter on my drone that I was eager to test. I set up my equipment on my back patio, carefully going through my pre-flight checklist. I planned to capture footage of my own landscaping progress to show my parents, plus test some new camera settings for an upcoming real estate job. The drone had been airborne for maybe 10 minutes, hovering about 30 feet above my own backyard, when I heard my gate slam open. I turned to see Patricia marching across my lawn like she owned the place, with 2 other HOA board members trailing behind her. Bob Hensley, the treasurer, looking uncomfortable, and Karen Mitchell, who always backs up whatever Patricia says. "Mr. Chin," Patricia shouted, her face already flushed with anger. "Land that surveillance device immediately. You are in direct violation of community guidelines." I kept my cool, lowered the drone to about 15 feet so it was clearly visible, and explained as calmly as I could, "Good morning, Patricia. I'm just testing my equipment over my own property. I've reviewed the HOA regulations and there's nothing that prohibits." "We passed an emergency rule last week," she interrupted, waving a paper in my face. "All unauthorized surveillance devices are strictly prohibited in Maple Ridge Estates. This is a matter of community safety and privacy." Bob, standing behind her, wouldn't meet my eyes. I addressed him directly, "Bob, you know this kind of rule change requires proper notice and a community vote according to state law." Before Bob could respond, Patricia cut in again, "We have received multiple complaints about your drone spying on neighbors' backyards and children. This is completely unacceptable." "That's simply not true," I said, feeling my temper rising but trying to stay professional. "I'm only filming my own property. I'd be happy to show you the footage right now to prove it." I reached for my controller to bring up the live view, but Patricia stepped closer. "Your so-called hobby is making residents feel unsafe in their own homes. As HOA president, I have the authority to confiscate rule-violating items until the next board meeting." At this point, Karen chimed in, "Several homeowners have reported seeing your drone hovering over their pools and patios, Mr. Chin. We take these complaints very seriously." "That's impossible," I replied. "The flight logs and footage would show." Just then my phone rang. It was an important client I'd been waiting to hear from about a job next week. I made the mistake of turning slightly to silence my phone, planning to call back later. In that brief moment, Patricia lunged forward and grabbed my controller from the patio table. Before I could react, she also snatched the drone case containing extra batteries and memory cards. "What are you doing?" I shouted, completely shocked by her brazen move. "You can't take my personal property. That's theft." Patricia backed away toward the gate, clutching my equipment worth thousands of dollars. "This device is confiscated until the next board meeting on Friday, where your violations will be discussed. You'll receive a formal notice of fines by tomorrow." Bob looked deeply uncomfortable now. "Patricia, I'm not sure we can actually. As president, I am authorized to enforce community standards," she cut him off sharply. I stepped toward them, saying firmly, "You need to return my property right now or I'll have to involve the police." Patricia gave me a cold smile. "Go ahead and call them. Dale confirmed that HOAs have the right to enforce their regulations. This drone is confiscated until Friday's meeting and that's final." With that, she turned and marched out of my yard with my expensive equipment, Karen scurrying after her. Bob hesitated, looking apologetic, before following them out. I stood there in complete disbelief, watching as Patricia carried my livelihood away as if she had every right to do so. Little did she know, the drone she left hovering above had some interesting automated features she was about to discover the hard way. What Patricia didn't realize in her power-drunk moment was that modern drones like mine have sophisticated safety systems built in. The DJI Mavic 3 Pro is designed with multiple fail-safe features to prevent loss or accidents. One of those features is particularly important: the return-to-controller function that activates automatically when the battery reaches 30% capacity. After Patricia stormed off with my controller in case, I was left standing in my backyard watching my drone still hovering about 15 feet above. I could have manually landed it using the DJI app on my phone as a backup controller, but a thought occurred to me. The drone had been flying for about 15 minutes already, which meant its battery would be getting low soon. I decided to wait and see what would happen. Sure enough, about 10 minutes later, I heard the familiar series of beeps from the drone indicating its battery had reached the critical 30% threshold. Without a controller to return to since Patricia had taken it, the drone initiated its secondary failsafe protocol, returning to its last known controller location. What made this particularly interesting is that when these emergency protocols activate, the drone automatically begins recording everything, storing footage on its internal memory as a safety measure. I watched as my drone smoothly rotated, adjusted its altitude to the FAA-required height for autonomous flight, and then began moving steadily in the direction Patricia had gone with my controller. Like a faithful pet, it was following the signal, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding below. I quickly grabbed my phone and keys and followed at a safe distance through my neighborhood's winding streets. The drone maintained a perfect legal height, recording everything beneath it as it sought to reunite with its controller. I stayed far enough back that Patricia wouldn't notice me, but close enough to keep an eye on my drone's path. The mechanical hum of the drone must have caught Patricia's attention because I saw her stop about halfway to her house, looking up with a confused expression. The controller in her hand was still powered on, emitting the signal my drone was faithfully following. Her confusion quickly turned to alarm as she realized the drone was hovering almost directly above her, its camera pointed downward, recording everything. She quickened her pace, occasionally looking up nervously at the drone that continued to follow her every move. When she reached her house, a large colonial at the end of Oakwood Drive, she rushed inside with my equipment, clearly thinking she'd be safe there. What she didn't realize was that the controller signal was still detectable, and my drone continued to hover over her property, recording everything while its battery slowly depleted further. I stayed at the corner of her street, watching this unfold and trying not to smile at the irony. The very device she claimed was invading privacy was now documenting her theft of my property, creating an indisputable record of exactly what had happened, all because she didn't understand the technology she was so determined to ban. About 15 minutes after Patricia disappeared into her house, I noticed a police cruiser turning onto her street with lights flashing but no siren. She must have called them about the drone. I had to laugh at the irony. The woman who had just stolen thousands of dollars of my equipment was now calling the police because the technology she didn't understand was functioning exactly as designed. I decided this was my moment. I approached the police car as it pulled into Patricia's driveway and waved to get the officer's attention. The officer, his nameplate read Officer Ramirez, rolled down his window with a questioning look. "Excuse me, officer," I said politely. "I believe I know why you've been called here. That's my drone hovering above this house, and the woman inside has my controller and equipment, which she took from my property without permission about 30 minutes ago. Officer Ramirez looked surprised. You're the owner of the drone we received a call about? A suspicious drone, stalking the homeowner. Yes, sir. I'm the owner. My name is Mike Chin. I have all my FAA registration documents right here on my phone, as well as proof of purchase. The drone is following its controller, which that woman, Patricia Walters, the HOA president, took from my backyard, claiming she was confiscating it for rule violations. As we were talking, a second police car pulled up. The situation was clearly getting the full treatment. Officer Ramirez asked me to wait while he approached the house with his partner. I stood by their vehicles, watching as my drone continued to hover overhead, now down to about 15% battery according to my phone app. Patricia opened her door before they even knocked, looking agitated. Thank goodness you're here. There's a drone stalking me. It followed me home and won't leave my property. It's an invasion of privacy and I want it stopped immediately. I couldn't hear everything from where I stood, but I could see Officer Ramirez calmly explaining something to her, then pointing back toward me. Patricia's expression changed instantly from righteous indignation to something closer to panic when she realized I was there. The officers motioned for me to join them at the door. As I approached, I could hear Patricia already changing her story. I was simply securing dangerous equipment that violates our community guidelines, she was saying rapidly. As HOA president, I have the authority to confiscate prohibited items until our next board meeting. Officer Ramirez turned to me. Mr. Chin, can you explain exactly what happened today? I laid out the events clearly and calmly, explaining how Patricia had entered my property uninvited and taken my equipment without permission while I was distracted by a phone call. I showed them the drone app on my phone with the flight path history and explained the return to controller failsafe feature. And the best part, I added, is that when the drone enters emergency return mode, it automatically records everything. There's footage of Ms. Walters taking my controller and case from my property, as well as her walking home with them. Patricia's face went pale. That's an invasion of privacy. He can't record me without consent. The second officer, whose nameplate read Officer Bryant, spoke up. Ma'am, when you're in public spaces like the street, there's no expectation of privacy. More importantly, did you enter Mr. Chin's property and take his equipment without permission? I was confiscating it. The HOA has rules against. Ms. Walters, Officer Ramirez interrupted firmly, HOA presidents don't have the legal authority to enter properties and take personal belongings. That's not confiscation, that's theft. While this conversation was happening, my drone's battery reached critical levels, and it initiated its final emergency protocol, landing in the nearest clear space, which happened to be Patricia's front lawn. The officers and I watched as it gently descended, still recording until it touched down safely. I believe that drone contains video evidence of exactly what happened today, I told the officers, and I'd like my controller and case returned immediately. Officer Ramirez turned to Patricia with a stern expression. Ms. Walters, I need you to return Mr. Chin's equipment right now. Patricia hesitated, looking like she was searching for another excuse. But our HOA guidelines clearly state. Ma'am, Officer Bryant cut in firmly, HOA guidelines don't override state law. You entered someone's property without permission and took items valued at over $2,000. That constitutes felony theft in this state. The color drained from Patricia's face. Felony? That's ridiculous. I was performing my duties as HOA president. Just then, Bob Hensley, who had witnessed the original confrontation, pulled up in his car. He hurried over looking concerned. Officers, I'm Bob Hensley, HOA treasurer. I was present earlier, and I have to say, I expressed concerns about taking Mr. Chin's property at the time. Patricia shot him a betrayed look. Bob, you know we passed that emergency rule against drones. Bob shook his head. Patricia, I told you during the impromptu meeting that we needed to follow proper procedures for rule changes. We never held a community vote, never provided the required 30-day notice, and our attorney never reviewed the language. I only went along today because you insisted it was an observation visit, only. Officer Ramirez looked between them. So, to be clear, Mr. Hensley, the HOA rule Ms. Walters was enforcing wasn't even properly implemented according to your own bylaws? That's correct, Bob admitted, and nothing in our guidelines authorizes confiscating personal property, even for legitimate violations. Patricia finally seemed to realize how serious her situation was. Without another word, she disappeared into her house and returned moments later with my controller and drone case. Here, she said tersely, thrusting them at me, But this isn't over. The board will be discussing your violations on Friday. Officer Bryant shook his head. Ms. Walters, you don't seem to understand the gravity of the situation. Mr. Chin has the right to press charges for theft. I retrieved my drone from her lawn, checking it carefully for damage. Fortunately, everything appeared intact. I don't necessarily want to press charges, I said, but I do want this harassment to stop, and I want a formal apology from the HOA board. Officer Ramirez nodded. That sounds reasonable. Ms. Walters, would you be willing to issue an apology rather than face potential charges? For the first time, Patricia looked genuinely worried. I suppose that would be acceptable. Over the next week, the situation evolved rapidly. The drone footage clearly showing Patricia taking my equipment circulated among board members after I submitted it as evidence for the Friday meeting. By Wednesday, I received a call from Bob Hensley informing me that the board had called an emergency session and voted to remove Patricia as president, effective immediately. We're issuing you a formal written apology, Bob told me, and we're scrapping the drone rule completely. Several homeowners have started a petition to reform our governance procedures to prevent this kind of overreach in the future. By the following week, I received an official letter from the HOA apologizing for the incident and confirming that Patricia had been removed from her position. The letter also included a check reimbursing my latest HOA dues payment as a gesture of goodwill. The most satisfying part? Patricia put her house up for sale 2 weeks later. Apparently, living in a community where everyone had seen footage of her power trip was too embarrassing to bear. The new HOA president, a retired judge named Gloria Simmons, has already started implementing more transparent processes for rule changes and enforcement. As for me, I'm still flying my drone legally and responsibly, and I've even been hired by several neighbors to capture aerial footage of their homes for insurance documentation. Sometimes the best revenge is simply letting technology do what it was designed to do.